The ER of Mercy General hummed with that particular rhythm of Tuesday afternoon, not quite the chaos of nights, not the controlled pace of mornings, but something in between where time felt negotiable. Elena Martinez moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors like someone who had learned to take up less space, a skill honed not in nursing school but in places where being seen could get people killed. She clocked in at 6:02, her badge clipping to her scrub pocket with a soft metallic click. The badge had her photograph from 18 months ago, her face rounder then, her eyes still carrying the weight of things she would not name. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like a secret written in thread. She touched it briefly in the locker room, fingertips finding the worn cotton emblem in the darkness before pulling on her white coat. The gesture took 3 seconds. It was the closest she came to prayer anymore. The ER bay stretched out in controlled chaos, 6 patient rooms on the left side, 2 trauma bays with overhead surgical lights, the central nursing station where the day shift was handing off to the swing rotation. Elena picked up the patient assignment board without waiting to be acknowledged. Bed 3, Mrs. Howell, 74, post-operative hip replacement, pain management. Bed 5, Mr. Chen, 61, acute gastritis, suspected bleed. Bed 7, Marcus Webb, 43, presenting with chest pain, EKG in progress. Room 2 isolation, David Reeves, 68, 3-day fever post-transplant, immunocompromised. She made her rounds in order, her hands moving with the kind of efficiency that came from having once worked in forward operating bases where every motion mattered. The 4 lines she checked hung in perfect tension. The monitor lead she adjusted aligned with muscle memory built in a trauma hospital in Baghdad, where she had run medical operations for an entire battalion and watched people stabilize under her hands who had no business being alive. With Mrs. Howell, she did not ask how the pain was. She observed the micro-expressions, the tightness at the corners of the mouth, the way the left leg remained more rigid than the right, the shallow breathing pattern suggesting guarding. Hip or abdominal pain? Elena asked, not moving to the chart immediately but watching. Hip mostly, Mrs. Howell said. But my stomach's been touchy. Elena did not rush. She palpated the abdomen with the kind of careful attention most nurses saved for educational moments. The liver edge was prominent. The spleen seemed enlarged. She felt the woman's radial pulse, regular, strong, 78 beats per minute, and something in her clinical mind made a notation, post-operative, immunosuppressed from anesthesia, fever risk window. She ordered labs before the physician would think to ask for them. You'll feel better within the hour, Elena said, and the older woman's shoulders dropped in relief at being heard. By 8:13, she had also found that Mr. Chen's gastritis was almost certainly from NSAIDs masking what looked like early GI perforation. The rebound tenderness was too sharp, too localized, and had quietly flagged the resident to do a CT scan instead of just starting proton pump inhibitors and watching. The resident looked at her like she had grown a second head when she mentioned it, then checked the chart, then checked again, then paged surgery. Elena was already moving to the next patient. This was the part of the job she could live with, the quiet competence that meant people did not die from things that could have been caught. She did not need credit. She did not need anyone's name for the thing inside her that could read vital signs the way other people read faces. She just needed the work to matter. The break room smelled of stale coffee and something sweet that had spilled 3 days ago and was never fully cleaned. Elena made her own coffee from the ground she brought from home, a Colombian dark roast that cost more than most staff seemed willing to spend, and stood by the window overlooking the parking lot. The morning sun hit the asphalt in a way that made it shimmer like heat haze, though the temperature was only 64 degrees. She did not hear Dr. Sterling come in until he was already speaking. His voice had the quality of someone used to not being interrupted, smooth as polished marble and twice as cold. You ordered labs on Mr. Chen without consulting me, he said. It was not a question. Elena turned. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of the break room wearing his white coat like a coronation robe, the stethoscope around his neck still pristine, the kind of thing that suggested it was more for show than actual use. His office was visible from here, glass walls overlooking the entire ER floor, a vantage point from which he could observe everyone without being observed in return. He had been watching her. Abdomen was too rigid for simple gastritis, Elena said. Her voice remained level. CT will confirm or rule out perforation. The resident is an attending physician, Dr. Sterling said. If they wanted imaging, they would order it. He paused, letting the implication settle. You're a floor nurse. There's a difference. Elena set her coffee cup down with the kind of precision that suggested she had learned to place things carefully in small spaces. She met his eyes directly. The patient deteriorates, the resident will be grateful for the data. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. In that silence, Dr. Sterling's face registered something that looked like surprise, the brief shock of someone discovering they were not in absolute control, before it shifted into something colder. He turned and left without another word, but Elena knew what she had just done. She had challenged the hierarchy. And in the ecosystem of a hospital where power depended on everyone accepting their place in the food chain, that was a kind of insurrection. She finished her coffee standing at the window. By 8:41, the CT scan had been ordered. By 9:16, the radiologist had called it perforated ulcer, microperforation, septic peritonitis beginning. Mr. Chen was in OR by 10 o'clock. By 13:23, he would be extubated and talking about his grandchildren, alive because someone had noticed something was wrong before it became catastrophic. Elena did not think about this as a victory. She thought about it as the work. The work that mattered. The work she could do here in Raleigh that did not require anyone to know who she had been or what she had done in places where the sky looked the same color as dried blood and people called you by a rank instead of a name. But something had shifted in that break room when she met Dr. Sterling's eyes. She had registered the moment when he decided she was not just a competent nurse, she was a threat to the architecture of authority he depended on. And in that registration, the machinery of the hospital had begun to turn in a direction that would either crush her or would require her to become something other than the invisible person she had worked so carefully to become. The afternoon staff arrived. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical song. In room 7, the EKG on Marcus Webb came back clear, and Elena walked him through the discharge paperwork with the kind of practical care that made him feel less like a fool for coming in with what turned out to be anxiety. She touched his shoulder once on the way to the door, a gesture of recognition, and he would remember later that this nurse had treated him like a human instead of a hypochondriac. By 14:22, Elena had stepped out of the ER for exactly 12 minutes to eat a protein bar and stand in the stairwell, where no one could see her hand trembling slightly as she pressed her palm against the cool concrete wall. The trembling was not fear. She had learned the difference between fear and the residual electrical charge that ran through her nervous system when she had been forced to step into the light instead of remaining in shadow. By 16:07, Dr. Sterling had made his first phone call from his office to the chief of nursing to discuss performance concerns and scope creep from floor staff. The conversation lasted for minutes and 38 seconds. Elena did not hear it, but she felt its aftermath the way animals feel pressure changes before a storm. The evening shift arrived at 6 p.m. Elena gave report on all for patients with the kind of concise detail that made the incoming nurses trust her immediately. She did not mention that Dr. Sterling had watched her for 6 minutes straight from his office window as she worked, his expression suggesting he was calculating something, distances, angles, leverage points, the precise architecture of a collapse. She clocked out at 18:51. And the faded unit patch remained hidden against her ribs where it had waited for 18 months in the dark, a reminder of a woman she had tried very hard to leave behind, and whom the machinery of the hospital was now beginning, whether she liked it or not, to resurrect. The charting could wait. Elena clocked out at 18:51, moving through the hospital corridors toward the staff exit, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut across the hallway like a blade through water. Martinez. My office. Now. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The tone was the kind that made junior residents straighten their spines and nurses check their scrub pockets for contraband. Elena turned without expression and followed him up the back stairs to the administrative wing. His office smelled of leather furniture and expensive coffee. Sterling closed the door with deliberate care, then crossed to the unit board mounted on his wall, the one visible to every family member, every patient, every staff member who walked past his domain. He had printed something. He pinned it with the precision of a general posting battle orders. Medication administration log, 14:22 hours, he said, not looking at her. You documented the Haldol drip 23 minutes after actual administration. 23 minutes. That's negligence, Martinez. That's a liability. That's the kind of detail that costs hospitals millions when families sue. He turned to face her, and his expression carried the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I'm posting this right up on the public unit board. Everyone needs to understand the standard we maintain here. Even the floor nurses. The emphasis landed like a fist. Even the floor nurses. As if she were something less than the surgical elite who occupied his corridors. Elena absorbed it with one measured breath. Understood, doctor. Do you? His voice dropped, became conversational in a way that made it worse. Because I'm not sure you do understand the standards at Mercy General. Not really. You were adequate at county hospitals, I'm sure. But this is different. We don't operate at that level here. She said nothing. The silence stretched. Sterling waited for something, a tremor, a defensive word, some crack in her composure that would confirm what he already believed. He didn't get it. Elena's hands hung at her sides, steady as surgical instruments. The next morning, the write-up was there. Laminated. Posted at the nurses' station entrance where 3 families were checking in, where the waiting room could see it clearly enough to read. Documented medication administration error, Elena Martinez, RN. Sterling had made sure of it. But that wasn't the worst part. The Hendersons were a difficult family, demanding, accusatory, their teenage daughter in ICU after a motorcycle accident showing signs of aspiration pneumonia. Dr. Sterling made rounds at 9:13, with Elena present to provide clinical updates. The daughter's oxygen saturation had dropped to 88% overnight despite aggressive suctioning and positioning. Elena had noted a subtle change in breath sounds on the left lower lobe, had already contacted respiratory therapy, had prepared for the possibility of intubation if the trend continued. Her mother asked about complications, Sterling said, loud enough that the family heard every word. I told her we'd have our best people monitoring her. Though of course, some of our staff have more limited training than others. He turned to Elena with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You did get your RN from a state school, correct? Not Johns Hopkins or Duke. I was just telling the Hendersons about the variation in nursing education across different institutions. The mother's face shifted. Doubt flickered there like a candle someone had just lit. Elena's jaw moved for a single second. She answered without inflection. University of North Carolina. Accelerated BSN program. For years. The facts were accurate and delivered like a soldier reading coordinates, precise, professional, devoid of defensiveness. Of course. Excellent schools, those public programs. Broad generalist training. Sterling turned back to the parents. What's important is that we have physicians making the critical decisions. The nurses are here for support, naturally. For the routine work. Elena watched the father lean back in his chair, reassured. Hierarchy restored. Threat neutralized. She excused herself to check on another patient, moving through the corridor with the kind of composure that came from having survived things Sterling's medical degree would never prepare him for. Things he couldn't even imagine. The break room at 11:13 a.m. was where it crystallized. Elena had 17 minutes until her medication pass. She sat at the corner table with her container of pre-cut vegetables and the thermos of black coffee she'd brought from home. 3 nurses were clustered by the refrigerator, newer staff, residents of Sterling's sphere of influence. They saw her. One of them said something quiet. They all stood. Not in a rush. Not dramatically. Just a careful, coordinated departure that took them toward the other end of the room, to a table where they sat with their backs toward her. The message was clear. Explicit without a word. Elena ate 3 bites of vegetables. Then she stood and left without finishing, without looking at them, without letting the smallest sign of discomfort cross her face. She'd been isolated before. She'd been alone in deserts where the silence was so complete it had a sound all its own. This was nothing. This was a break room at a civilian hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it meant nothing. Except that Dr. Sterling had taught the staff how to weaponize proximity. How to make presence itself feel like a threat. The shift ended at 1938. Elena was updating a discharge summary when Sterling found her at the medication station, where the evening light through the windows had turned everything amber and blue. His expression carried the confidence of a man accumulating pieces, building a structure. "The 0800 potassium supplement in room for 12, he said. "You charted it at 8:17. Patient aid verified administration at 8:04. 13 minutes discrepancy. Again. Do you understand how that looks? How it appears when a nurse consistently documents medications after the fact? It looks like you're fabricating records. It looks like you can't perform basic clinical tasks within acceptable parameters." Elena's hand stilled. She looked at him directly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that no one else in the station could hear it clearly. Just him. "I've seen what real leadership looks like, Doctor. I've watched it operate under conditions you can't fathom, with people depending on every decision with their lives on the line. This isn't it." She wiped the single tear that had escaped, the one she allowed herself, with the back of her wrist, never breaking eye contact. The gesture held no shame. No apology. Just acknowledgement of the weight of it, and the decision to carry it anyway. Sterling's face went very still. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, not anger yet, but something worse. Recognition that his assault hadn't landed the way he'd intended. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't defended herself. She'd simply stated a fact about the difference between them, and walked away. Elena clocked out at 19:51 and drove home through the Raleigh evening traffic, her hands on the wheel, her breathing steady, her composure intact. The faded unit patch remained hidden where it had lived for 18 months, sewn inside the jacket lining, a reminder of a woman she'd tried to leave behind, a woman whose skills and training and bone-deep competence were now being systematically dismantled by a man who'd never heard a helicopter land or felt a combat medic's fingers searching for a pulse in the dark. But the machinery was beginning to turn. And some machines, once started, run until something stops them completely. That night, her phone rang at 23:22. It was dispatch. 3 incoming patients from a MVA on I-40, all critical, ETA 5 minutes. She called back and asked which trauma surgeon was on duty. It was Sterling. The trauma bay doors burst open at 2:13 p.m. on a Wednesday, and the patient came in screaming, a construction worker with a pneumothorax so severe his lungs were already collapsing around themselves. The chest X-ray showed a collapsed right lung, air trapped in the pleural space, pressure building like a bomb with a countdown nobody could hear. Elena was 2 steps ahead before anyone else registered what they were looking at. She'd already read the triage note. She already knew the timeline. 16 minutes since the crush injury. Vital signs dropping. Oxygen saturation at 78 and falling. The surgical intern stood frozen, staring at the monitor like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. Angiocath. 14 gauge. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Elena's voice had changed. It wasn't a question anymore. The deferential nurse was gone. This was command voice, the kind that came from having stood over bodies in field conditions where hesitation cost lives. The resident who'd been standing at the bedside for 30 seconds without moving suddenly understood that he wasn't the authority in this room anymore. Neither was the attending who'd wandered in with his coffee still steaming. A grizzled man in the corner, transfer patient from the orthopedic ward, wearing a hospital gown that hung loose on shoulders crisscrossed with surgical scars, watched Elena move. His body went absolutely still. His hands, which had been fiddling with the full line in his own arm, stopped mid-motion. He recognized something in the way she moved. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Movement like someone who'd done this in places where the lights didn't work and the ambient temperature was 127 degrees and the only sound was someone's arterial bleeding and your own heartbeat, and nothing else mattered because 3 people depended on your hands in the next 60 seconds. Elena's hands were already gloved. Sterile field. Prep the chest wall with chlorhexidine in a circular motion, starting at the insertion point and working outward in expanding concentric circles. The antiseptic smell cut through the room's stale air like a scalpel through tissue. One of the nurses grabbed the needle from the tray, still moving too slowly, still operating at civilian speed, and Elena accepted it with the kind of precision that made the handoff look like choreography. The patient was gasping now. Oxygen saturation dropping, 72. 68. The monitor beeped with the rhythm of something going wrong very quickly. The intern finally found his voice, started to say something about calling the attending surgeon, about needing authorization, about protocol, and Elena didn't even look at him. He's dying. Right now. I'm fixing it. The needle went in smooth and confident. Perpendicular to the chest wall, angled slightly cephalad, the needle sliding through skin and subcutaneous tissue and the intercostal muscles until she felt the give, the hiss of air escaping under pressure, the kind of sound that meant space was opening up where it needed to, pressure releasing, lungs able to expand again. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The monitor started climbing. 72, 75. 79, 82. 88, 92. Oxygen saturation normalizing in real time, the patient's desperate gasping becoming actual breaths, becoming something close to normal respiration. The whooshing sound of his chest expanding, a sound nobody else in that room would forget. The grizzled man in the corner made a sound. Just a breath. Just an intake that contained the entire weight of recognition. Elena's hands were steady as surgical lasers as she secured the catheter with tape, her movements exact and economical, every action purposeful, nothing wasted, nothing performed for an audience. When she finally stepped back from the bedside, the crisis wasn't over but it was contained. The patient was breathing. The saturation was holding. The attending surgeon had finally arrived, had taken one look at what Elena had done, and had the presence of mind to understand that he'd just watched someone operate outside his pay grade. "Good work, Martinez," the surgeon said, and Elena nodded once without meeting his eyes. She was already stripping off the gloves, already moving toward the door to document, to transition the patient to the next phase of care. But the grizzled man was still staring at her. His hands had gone white-knuckled on the bedrail of his own bed. "Wait." His voice came out rough. "Wait, that's a Kandahar stitch. That insertion technique. That's not standard stateside. Where the hell did you learn trauma surgery?" Elena's hands paused for exactly one heartbeat. She didn't look at him. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. She just finished removing the gloves with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she'd heard the question and had decided not to answer it. The silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that comes when someone in the room has just recognized someone else, and that second person has just confirmed it through the simple act of not speaking. "You're coming with me." Not a question. Not a request. Command. Elena gestured to the orderly without looking back at the transfer patient. The man in the hospital gown watched her leave the trauma bay, his jaw working like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had just shifted. He'd served. He understood field medicine in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. And he understood that nobody learned a needle decompression like that, with that kind of fluid muscle memory, with that kind of calm under pressure, unless they'd done it for real. Unless they'd done it when people died if you hesitated. Word moved through Mercy General like a current through water. By the end of her shift, 3 nurses had found excuses to stop by Elena's station. 2 residents had actually asked her questions about procedure technique instead of talking over her. The surgical intern had sought her out specifically to apologize for his frozen response. They didn't know who she was. Not really. But they understood that they'd watched something in that trauma bay that went beyond nursing school certification. They understood that Elena Martinez had hands that had saved lives in conditions most of them would never imagine. The attending surgeon mentioned it to his wife over dinner. One of the nurses texted a friend in the ER. By Thursday morning, people were looking at Elena differently. Not with hostility. Not with the casual dismissal they'd shown before. With something closer to recognition. With the understanding that quietness wasn't weakness. That someone could move through a hospital for 18 months and never tell you who they actually were. But what they didn't know was that the transfer patient, the one with the scarred shoulders and the Kandahar memory, was making phone calls from his hospital room. And the grizzled army medic didn't forget faces. Didn't forget techniques. Didn't forget the way someone moved when they'd operated in the same dust Elena had operated in, under the same pressure, in the same kind of darkness. He remembered a senior chief. A woman who'd run triage in Anbar province. A woman who'd disappeared from service files almost 18 months ago with an official discharge listing PTSD as the reason for separation. He made one call to someone he trusted. Then another. Then a third to someone higher up the chain. And he told them all the same thing: she's here. She's alive. And she's working as a floor nurse in Raleigh, North Carolina. That was the moment everything changed. Not the needle decompression. Not the technique. Not the moment Elena had made the choice to save a life instead of stay anonymous. The moment that changed everything was the moment a broken veteran lying in a hospital bed decided that the woman who'd once held his hand while they waited for a medevac deserved to be known for what she actually was. The ER doors exploded inward at 2:24 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the man who came through them moved like a wrecking ball wrapped in human skin. 6'7", maybe 280, every muscle corded and twitching, his eyes rolling back in that particular way that meant PCP, the kind of high that erased pain and replaced it with pure animal violence. He screamed something wordless, something that bypassed language entirely, and hurled a crash cart across the waiting area like it weighed nothing. Then he grabbed the nearest nurse, Derek, fresh out of orientation, and threw him against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. The sound was a gunshot. A wet crack followed by Derek sliding down, gasping, his arm bent at an angle that meant surgical repair and 3 months of PT. The waiting room erupted. Patients scrambled for exits. A mother pulled her child behind a potted plant. Security came running, saw the size of him, the feral focus in his eyes, and stopped moving backward. One of them reached for his radio. His hand shook. Dr. Sterling stood behind the nurse's station, his face already draining of color. He barked orders that nobody heard: step back, everyone step back, we need to secure the perimeter, but his voice came out thin and mannered, like he was reading from a script nobody wanted to hear. He didn't move toward the man. He moved toward the supply room door, putting the desk between himself and the threat, his chin held high in that particular way of someone trying to pretend he wasn't afraid. The man advanced. His movements had no grace, no calculation. Just momentum. Raw. He locked onto a target, a woman in a wheelchair, maybe 30 weeks pregnant, clutching a folder of ultrasound images, and started toward her with his hands open and his mouth moving in that same wordless scream. The woman tried to roll backward. The wheelchair caught on something. She was going to be within his reach in 3 seconds. Elena moved before she thought about moving. Her body didn't ask permission. Her body had spent 18 months trying to be small and useful and forgettable, but 18 months before that it had spent every daylight hour learning exactly how to shut down threats with precision and speed. Muscle memory didn't care about choices made in Raleigh. It cared about survival. It cared about the pregnant woman about to take a hit from a man running at full speed on a cocktail of PCP and rage. She angled in from his left. He swung at her without looking, a wild haymaker thrown from the hip, the kind of punch that had no technique, all force. She pivoted through it, let the momentum pass her ribs by inches, felt the air move hot where her face had been a moment before. His arm was still extended when she drove her palm up into his solar plexus. Not a punch. A palm strike, the kind that transfers force through the whole body, through the ground, through something older than thought. The impact stopped him. His breath came out in a wheeze. His eyes widened, the animal confusion of someone whose body had suddenly stopped obeying the noise in his brain. Elena hooked his ankle with her left leg while he was still off balance, her weight already shifting to drive him down. He fell like a tree. His body hit the linoleum face first, and she was on top of him before he could process what had happened, her left arm locked around his neck, her right hand on his wrist, her leg hooked through his, the whole thing a textbook suplex to joint lock that she'd executed 1,000 times in 1,000 training iterations. He thrashed. He tried to roll. He couldn't move. Not because of strength. Because of geometry. Because she understood leverage and he understood only rage. For seconds. That was all it took. His face pressed against the cold floor. His right arm locked at an angle that promised serious pain if he tested it. His body had no options left. He breathed hard through his nose, the fight draining out of him as his brain started catching up to the fact that he wasn't winning this. The PCP was still in his system, but even PCP understands anatomy. Even PCP knows when it's beaten. The ER went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from an absence of sound. The kind that comes from everyone holding their breath at the same moment. The fluorescent panels buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. A beeping that meant someone was still alive. Elena was still alive. The pregnant woman was still safe. The man under Elena's arms was immobilized and contained and about to be very heavily sedated by the nurses who were already moving toward them with syringes. Elena kept her breathing controlled. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Her hands were steady on his wrist and neck. Her eyes were on the ceiling, on nothing, on the place inside herself where all of this lived. The place she'd been trying to leave behind for 18 months. The murmur started before security even reached them. Whispers that rippled through the ER like a current. Did you see that? Where did she learn to do that? The pregnant woman's hand was shaking. Not from fear anymore. From relief. From witnessing something that looked like salvation wearing scrubs. Dr. Sterling emerged from behind the nurse's station. He watched Elena on the floor, watched her release the man to security with the same efficiency she'd subdued him, watched her stand and brush off her scrubs without a single tremor, without a single moment of drama or acknowledgement. She walked to the sink and washed her hands. Soap. Water. Paper towel. The gesture of someone doing routine maintenance on the day. His face was a map of something complicated. Anger. Fear. The sudden, desperate realization that the hierarchy he'd spent 18 months constructing, one where Elena was small and incompetent and dependent on his authority, had just been detonated by 4 seconds and a woman whose composure hadn't cracked in the slightest. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. The staff stood scattered around the ER, nobody moving to their stations yet, all of them watching Elena with a kind of attention usually reserved for things that had just changed everything. A nurse from the orthopedic floor was already texting someone. A resident was pulling out his phone. The story was spreading. The story was multiplying. And Dr. Sterling felt something ancient and protective flare in his chest, the kind of thing that makes men reach for institutions instead of their own hearts. She'd made him look small. She'd done it in front of witnesses. She'd done it by being exactly what he'd spent 18 months insisting she wasn't: competent, controlled, dangerous in the way that only true training can make someone dangerous. He walked toward her as she dried her hands. My office. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Elena turned to him. Her eyes were steady. Her breathing was normal. If anything, she looked more composed now than she had before, like the violence had been a kind of exhale, a release valve for something that had been pressurized for far too long. She followed him. The ER was already calling for maintenance. Already starting to move again. Already beginning the process of returning to normal. But everyone knew. Everyone in the hospital was already beginning to wonder who that nurse really was. And that wondering was a thread that, once pulled, would unravel everything Dr. Sterling had spent 18 months building. His office was small and decorated with credentials that cost more than some people's annual salaries. He closed the door. What you did down there was textbook excessive force and failure to follow de-escalation protocols. Elena said nothing. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching him with a kind of attention that made him feel seen in a way he didn't enjoy. I've already placed a call to the hospital board president. Followed immediately by contact to your references. You listed 3. All military, I notice. All of whom I've already informed that I'm filing a formal complaint regarding your mental stability and your violent tendencies. He paused. She still said nothing. He needed her to react. He needed her to defend herself. The lack of response was worse somehow than anger would have been. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker to collect your personal belongings. Your badge, your credentials, your access cards, all of it. You will not be allowed back on this campus. I've instructed HR to process your termination as insubordination and assault. You will never work as a nurse in this state again. Elena reached up and unpinned her badge. She set it on his desk with the care she might have used placing flowers on a grave. The small, silver-plated rectangle with her name and the hospital logo. 18 months of walking these halls. 18 months of learning how to be quiet. 18 months of letting Dr. Sterling chip away at her without response. 18 months of choosing this place to heal instead of choosing home. Understood, she said. Her voice was even. Not broken. Not angry. Not desperate. Just level, like she was confirming a lab result or signing off on discharge papers. That was what made him feel the most threatened. That she could accept obliteration without flinching. Security escorted her to her locker. She collected the things that were hers, a water bottle, a sweater, the jacket with the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining. Everything else she left. The photographs that other nurses had taped to the inside of the door. The schedule for next week that would now have her name crossed off. The small laminated quote someone had posted, "Nurse, a person who gives without limit, receives without obligation, and loves without conditions." She walked out of Mercy General at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the weight of 18 months of silence came down on her shoulders like something physical. The rain started before she reached the parking garage. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammered down from a sky that had turned the color of old concrete, that turned the asphalt into a mirror of traffic lights and brake lights and the red glow of taillights stretching out toward the highway. She sat in her car for 2 hours. Then she drove to a bus stop on the south side of Raleigh, where the neighborhoods got quieter and the streetlights came on early. She sat on a bench that was wet from hours of downpour, and she counted the money in her wallet. $43 and change. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for much of anything. Her phone had 12 missed calls. 5 from unknown numbers. The rest from veteran counseling centers and military crisis lines, the referrals her references must have provided the moment they heard she was fired. Everyone had known. Everyone had seen. The story had already spread to people she'd never met, people who were already starting to wonder if she was a liability or a legend. She held the jacket with the unit patch. She'd considered throwing it away so many times. 18 months of carrying this weight. 18 months of keeping this secret. 18 months of choosing a quiet life over a life that had meaning. She pulled the patch out of the lining, held it under the rain, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought about letting it fall. A piece of fabric in the rain. A patch that had been sewn by hands that had been splattered with blood and dirt and things she'd never fully let herself remember. A patch that meant she'd been somewhere and done something that mattered. That meant there was a version of her that existed before Raleigh. Before Dr. Sterling. Before the choice to disappear. The rain hit her face. Her hand shook, but not from cold. From something older. From pressure building behind her eyes that had nowhere to go. Her eyes burned, the way they always burned when she was alone. But soldiers don't cry. Not really. Not where it counts. They just sit in the rain on a bench at 8:13 p.m. and remember that there are people who know who they are. People who would come if they knew where to look. She folded the patch and put it back in the jacket lining. And then she heard it. A sound cutting through the rain. Not a car engine. Not traffic. The rotors of a helicopter, distant but getting closer, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of something military that made every nerve in her body snap awake. She looked up. The sound was coming from the north, from the direction of the hospital. She didn't move. She just sat there, wet and empty and waiting, because some part of her had always known that this particular silence couldn't last forever. The wet bench stayed wet. Elena sat motionless, rain soaking through her scrubs, through the thin jacket she'd borrowed from the break room, through everything. $43 in her pocket. No job. No references anymore, or at least not the kind that mattered. She'd done the math. Rent was due in 8 days. Her truck needed new brake pads. The medical school loan she'd quietly been paying back for 11 years weren't going to pause while she figured out her next move. She didn't cry. Not then. Not when she'd cleared her locker at 6:36 p.m. and security had watched her leave like she might steal something on her way out. Not when the badge, the one with her photograph from exactly 18 months ago, before all of this, had been scanned and deactivated. The system made a sound like a door closing forever. The guard hadn't looked at her face. Nobody did anymore. But across town, in a downtown office building on Fayetteville Street, Dr. Sterling was making calls. The first call landed at 6:58 p.m. Richard Bancroft, hospital board president, was 3 scotches into his evening when the number came through. Bancroft golfed with Sterling every Thursday. Bancroft owed Sterling a favor, actually. Bancroft owed Sterling 3 favors: a patient referral 5 years back that had made the man's daughter-in-law wealthy, a recommendation that got Bancroft's nephew into Johns Hopkins, and a discreet conversation with a colleague that had made sure nobody asked questions about Bancroft's medical school grades. Sterling collected favors like ammunition. "Richard, we have a situation." Sterling's voice was controlled, almost reasonable. The voice of a concerned administrator, not a man eliminating a threat. One of our floor nurses, Elena Martinez, 18 months, 0 management issues until today, assaulted a patient in front of multiple witnesses. She's ex-military, and I'm worried about PTSD episodes escalating. We need to protect the hospital's liability before she talks to a lawyer. Bancroft heard assault and military and liability. His lawyer brain fired up. By the time Sterling finished the sentence, he'd already made a decision. "I'll call the HR investigator we used for the Brennan situation. Document everything. You have photographs of injuries. The patient she threw is on observation. Possible concussion. I have incident reports from security." Sterling was already thinking ahead, layering facts that weren't quite lies. The man had thrown himself at her. She had defended the pregnant woman. But liability sounded different when you were the one controlling the narrative. By 7:15 p.m., the investigator was on his email. By 7:42 p.m., Sterling was making the second set of calls. Elena's listed references. 3 of them. The first was her supervisor from a private nursing firm she'd worked for before Mercy General. Sterling had a script prepared. He didn't accuse Elena of anything. He asked quiet questions. Did you ever notice any behavioral inconsistencies? Any incidents where she seemed to overreact? We're handling a sensitive termination and want to make sure we're being thorough. The supervisor, eager to be helpful, mentioned an incident from 4 years back where Elena had stayed late without being asked. He'd interpreted it as dedication, but now, framed through Sterling's careful questions, it sounded like obsessive behavior. Possible instability. The supervisor heard himself saying things he didn't mean, but once the words were out, they hung in the air like contamination. The second reference was worse. An RN instructor from Elena's accelerated program. Sterling's opening line: "I'm calling about Elena Martinez, who trained under you 10 years ago. We've had a concerning incident and I want to verify her psychological stability before we move forward with an exit strategy." The instructor didn't know Elena had been gone from that program for 8 years. Didn't remember her specifically. But she remembered the general cohort. Some of those nurses had struggled, some had been intense, some had issues. Sterling never said Elena had issues. He just implied they were checking on something, and insinuation did 90% of the work for him. By 8:06 p.m., he had 3 character references that, read in sequence by an HR investigator, painted a picture of a woman with potential psychological instability masked by competence. A woman with no social connections at the hospital. A woman whose past was somehow suspicious because she so rarely discussed it. The outside investigator arrived at 9:22 a.m. the next morning. His name was David Ames, and he was precisely the kind of professional who saw problems in paperwork rather than in people. He'd worked terminations for 27 years. He knew how to build a file that protected the institution. Sterling had called ahead excessive force, failure to follow de-escalation protocols, previous behavioral indicators from references, safety concern for other staff. Ames had already decided the direction before he interviewed Elena. She came in at 2:13 p.m. in clean scrubs, her hair still damp from the shower she'd taken before arriving at Mercy General, not knowing why she was being summoned to HR. She sat in the chair across from Ames and Sterling. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and something else, the particular staleness of fluorescent light that never turns off. Ames opened a file. Ms. Martinez, we've initiated a formal investigation into yesterday's incident in the emergency department. We have multiple witness accounts suggesting you used excessive physical force against a patient. We also have concerns about your psychological fitness based on reference checks. Elena's fingers were steady on the table. The patient was assaulting staff. A pregnant woman was in danger. De-escalation protocol requires you to wait for security, Ames said. You did not wait. You took independent physical action. Security was 30 seconds away. The patient had already hospitalized one nurse. Yet your quick action prevented anyone from talking him down, didn't it? You eliminated the option for peaceful resolution. Ames said this as though it were an accusation, as though she should have waited for another staff member to be hurt. Sterling watched her from across the table. He was waiting for tears or anger or the kind of defensive outburst that would validate his narrative. Elena gave him nothing. Her voice dropped a half octave. I secured the scene. The pregnant woman wasn't injured. The staff member was getting medical attention. Nevertheless, Ames pulled out a document. Based on our investigation and your references, the hospital has determined that your continued employment poses a liability risk. You're being terminated effective immediately for violation of use of force protocols and concerns about judgment and psychological stability. You'll receive 2-week severance, COBRA documentation, and an exit interview with security. He slid a termination letter across the table. The letterhead read, Termination Notice, Elena Martinez, for cause. Elena picked up the letter. The words were there in black ink: excessive force, failure to follow protocols, psychological fitness, immediate dismissal, no severance appeal. Her 18 months at Mercy General summarized in 3 paragraphs written by a man who'd never spoken to her until 30 seconds ago. She set the letter down. She looked at Sterling. You called my references. It wasn't a question. Sterling's face didn't shift. We conduct thorough investigations during terminations. You implied I was unstable. We verified your history. You fabricated a narrative. Elena's voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that made people listen. That man was high on PCP. He threw a nurse into a wall. I stopped a threat. You fired me for it because I proved I'm competent at something you're not. Sterling's jaw tightened. You physically assaulted a patient. I physically protected your staff. Elena stood up. She looked at Ames. You got paid to write that letter without asking me anything except my name. That's your reputation now. She left the room at 2:41 p.m. Security walked her out. The process took exactly 12 minutes, badge deactivated at the desk, personal items from her locker packed into a paper box, a final scan at the exit to make sure she wasn't stealing hospital property. The guard's name tag read Morrison. He didn't look at her. Most people don't look at people who are leaving. By 3:33 p.m., Sterling was back in his office with a bottle of 18-year-old Macallan Scotch. The board president was calling him in 20 minutes to congratulate him on his decisive action. The hospital's liability exposure had been neutralized. The threat to hierarchy had been removed. Sterling poured 3 fingers and sat back in his leather chair. Cost $4,200, Italian leather, imported through a medical device company that had needed his referrals, and felt the weight of control settle back onto his shoulders. The martini had been unnecessary. The firing had done everything it was supposed to do. A single difficult nurse, erased from the system. A clear message to the remaining staff: show competence at the wrong time and you're the problem, not the solution. Hierarchy restored. Authority unquestioned. He was smiling when he lifted the glass. 72 hours later, Elena sat in a waiting room she'd spent 18 months avoiding. The VA hospital in Raleigh occupied a converted military barracks from 1983, and nothing in the building had been updated since the furniture stopped being government surplus sometime in the late 1990s. The chairs were metal frame with vinyl cushions that stuck to exposed skin. The floor was linoleum in a shade of beige that suggested institutional surrender. The smell was fluorescent light and grief, the particular combination of places where people are broken and trying to get fixed. Elena signed in at 10:06 a.m. under a false last name. The intake coordinator didn't look twice. Half the people who came to the VA did that. She took a number, B47, and waited. Across the room sat a man with a prosthetic leg and a service dog. Next to him, a woman with the tremor that came from untreated blast trauma. Behind her, 3 men who weren't talking to each other, just staring at a television playing a rerun of a cooking show. They looked like the men she'd treated on stretchers in field hospitals. Same 1,000-yard stare. Same way their hands opened and closed involuntarily. Same absence of something that was supposed to be there. Elena knew that absence. Had carried it with her for 18 months while working 12-hour shifts and pretending the nightmares weren't waking her at 3:15 a.m. While watching her hands shake before procedures and learning to grip them steady. While sitting in her apartment on Saturday nights and not calling anyone because calling people meant explaining where she'd been and what she'd done and why she couldn't quite remember how to exist in the world without a weapon or a radio or a mission. The intake coordinator called B47 at 11:38 a.m. The psychiatric screening took exactly 40 minutes. The questions were always the same because they were designed to measure the same thing: how close to breaking are you? Do you think about harming yourself? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much have you slept this week? The answer Elena gave to that last question was 0. Which meant 4 hours maximum. The coordinator wrote it down and scheduled her first appointment for Monday. When she left the building at 12:06 p.m., the parking lot was empty except for a handful of cars. She sat in her truck for 17 minutes without turning the key. Just sat there with her hands on the steering wheel and watched other people leave the building, men and women in various states of reassembly, all of them walking away from the place they'd come to get put back together. She thought about calling someone. Thought about calling the number from the card she'd gotten at intake. Thought about admitting to a stranger with a clipboard that the last 72 hours had been what everything else had been building toward. That losing the job had been the final thing, the last piece of the life she'd constructed that had any shape or definition. That she was 41 years old and living in a studio apartment and working shifts at a hospital, and the only reason any of it mattered was because it was a way to not be what she actually was. She started the truck and drove home. That same evening, Dr. Sterling clinked glasses with board members in a restaurant uptown. The sommelier had opened a Burgundy from 2009. The stakes were prime cut. The conversation centered on his decisive action and his commitment to protecting hospital culture. By 7:51 p.m., he was explaining to Richard Bancroft that the Martinez situation was a perfect example of why institutional standards mattered. One person thinks the rules don't apply to her, and suddenly everybody's doing whatever they want. Leadership means setting a line. Bancroft nodded. Bancroft agreed. Bancroft's daughter called during dessert and Sterling answered it personally to offer his congratulations on her engagement. He was still the center. The power still flowed inward. The world still revolved around his capacity to define reality. He didn't know that in the VA hospital parking lot, a woman in a truck had finally stopped pretending. He didn't know that the man she'd saved in the operating room 3 days ago, the army medic with the prosthetic knee, had made a phone call while sitting in a waiting room on the 8th floor. A call to a number he'd had in his contacts for 14 years, untouched and uncalled because some brothers you don't call unless the world is ending. He'd dialed because he'd recognized something in her hands and her silence and the way she moved under pressure. Had recognized a senior chief, an adept, and a woman who needed her people to remember who she was. The call had gone to a man named Holloway. And Holloway had made 3 more calls. By the time Sterling was ordering cognac at 9:13 p.m., the arrangements were already made. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.